Thank you for coming. This is an evening of tributes to John Berger, who is, if I can dare say, one of the spirit guides of this program. So I want to thank Annette in absentia for making this possible, and also Levi, as always. 10 people will read and give remarks after me, and I thank each of them for making time. A special welcome to our friends and neighbors at the curatorial program upstairs who are also here with us. Are they here? Yeah. Okay, good. So I would begin with a few words on the importance of this event. Indeed, the words are John Berger's. In the 2016 film, John Berger or the Art of Looking, which is kind of streaming here, produced by the BBC, he speaks with his German translator about the dead. We need the dead to recognize ourselves in any way. The dead are essential to us, and that recognition begins with the accompanying mortality, not immortality, mortality. This evening, I imagine we have gathered to keep company with John Berger. Most of the words will be his, read by us and accepted from his stories or essays or poems. I hope the words will return with him like the proverbial coin without which one cannot cross over to the next life. In this life, Berger lived many lives, and this evening indicates that. The number of lives that enter into our own is incalculable, he wrote. His life entered into yours and mine, hence he was kind of legion. Me, I was a 22-year-old eager to write about art. His writing was the earliest glimpse I had of the road ahead. I want to read a little story you can find in From A to X, his novel in letters. I have retold this story to myself many, many times. Gustavo the Shoemaker is old and dies. He dies in his shop whilst repairing a pair of sandals. An angel accompanies him to heaven. At one moment, the angel speaks. If you want to, you can now look down and you'll see the footprints of your life. The old man does so, and he sees the long trail of his steps. Why is it, he asks, that 2 or 3 times for quite a long way, my footprints stopped, as if my life had ended and I had died? How is it possible? And the angel laughs and replies, those were the times I carried you. And finally, I would like to read a little note from one of his last books, Confabulations. What has prompted me to write over the years is the hunch that something needs to be told, and that if I don't try to tell it, it risks not being told. I picture myself not so much as a consequential professional writer, as a stopgap man. After I've written a few lines, I let the words slip back into the creature of their language, and there they are constantly recognized and greeted by a host of other words, with whom they have an affinity of meaning, or of opposition, or of metaphor, or alliteration, or rhythm. I listen to their confabulation. Together they are contesting the use to which I put the words I chose. They are questioning the roles I allotted them. So I modify the lines, change a word or two, and submit them again. Another confabulation begins. And it goes on like this until there's a low murmur of provisional consent. Then I proceed to the next paragraph. Another confabulation begins. Others can place me as the like as a writer. For myself, I'm the son of a beach, and you can guess who the beach is, no? Michael, thank you.
It's great to be here. A chance to talk a little bit about someone we all care about who's meant a lot to us, I think, and really interesting for me because I think we've got our own John Bergers to hear what people read, and the particular John Bergers that belong to the people who are also participating in this event. I first encountered him, or encountered his book, and this was, I don't know why I brought these, but I felt that it was important for me too, and this was the first book that I encountered, and it was in 1970, so it's a long time ago. And it's just selected essays and articles. It's called The Look of Things. And And my period with Berger really was the 70s. I continued to read him afterward, but that was the moment or the decade where I felt most marked by him. And I feel when I wanted to consider what I was going to say tonight, that was the period that I went back to. And the three books that I looked at were that book, The Look of Things, and The Success of Failure and Failure of Picasso and A Seventh Man. I came across The Look of Things in Paris in a bookstore where I was living. I don't know what got me to it. I don't know what made me look at it, but anyway, I picked it up and read it, and then basically I read everything of his for the next 10 or 20 years. But it was, since he has a connection with France, I just thought I would mention something about Paris because it was such a particular place at that time. And it was just after 68 where you could really feel 68, you could feel the post-colonialism there, and post-structuralism was beginning. And it was also a city that was quite different than the way it is now. A friend of mine, Raymond Mason, who was a good friend of Berger's, described Paris as a city of villages. And it was very different before. It was not, the gentrification around in the Marais, where the Pompidou Center hadn't happened. The gentrification around République and around the Bastille hadn't happened. So it was a city that was much more connected, I think, to villages and to rural life, and where there was some kind of real intersection between rural life and a kind of urban life that was impinging on that quite violently. And what I also wanted to say about Paris is that it's a city where I lived there for a decade, and it's a city in which I felt that I belonged to the world more than any other city that I've lived in, and I feel some connection, with that to Berger. It was not just that you were constantly running into and aware of the presences of people from many parts of Africa, but you turn on the radio and you hear every country in Europe, and you heard North Africa, and there was what I felt was a kind of awareness of the world, I would put it that way, that I kind of locate him in a little bit. I also wanted to mention something about journalism, because I think it's important for Berger. He wrote a lot at the beginning for the New Statesman, and I think writing for the New Statesman was probably a little bit like writing for a Partisan Review or The Nation now. In other words, it was a political publication. It had dealt with culture, dealt with politics, and there was also an expectation of a reader, of a certain kind of direct contact with the reader, and a way of using language that, obviously for those of us who care about Berger, a certain kind of availability to the language, a certain kind of mode of address that I think of a little bit in relation to journalism, or in relation to the years that he spent there. And I also think it seems to me that there's something about the quality of his writing that it's always news. It's always something that's happening in the present, and it continues to happen in the present. There's a kind of newsworthiness, or a kind of news energy to his writing that's all the way through, and it never becomes dated. He quotes Picasso, "The several manners I've used in my art must not be considered as an evolution or as steps toward an unknown ideal of painting. All I've ever made was made for the present, and with the hope that will always remain in the present." Berger's writing stays in the present. And also something about that's striking to me about reading those essays now, they never feel cramped. Whether he was writing 1,000 words or 1,500 words, there's always a sense that he had enough space, or there was enough space to say what he wanted to say. Anyway, it's just to make a point that I think that journalism, and particularly print journalism, is really important. I think that for him, the printed page was a special, I'm tempted to say, sacred place. It was where writer, reader, and world met, and after the interchange, he believed, I think, that each would be a bit different. Berger had an ingrained site specificity. Each person, each body and place had its own reality. Each project could demand its own language, typeface, spacing, and imagery, its own velocity of encounter. The success and failure of Picasso was an entirely different project than Ways of Seeing, which was very different from The Seventh Man, which was very different from G. But they're all episodic. They're all unpredictable constellations. Berger was interested in the totality of a work and a person. This is clear in The Seventh Man, where he took on the issue of the male migrant worker and narrated his existence in village, city, job, and cramped living quarters. He wrote about travel, family, desire, and fantasy, and how the migrant worker tried to use the system and the system used him. No one genre of writing was sufficient for the task. The book mixes journalism, fiction, and political analysis. Berger kept referring to the importance of trying to see or imagine the whole. From The Seventh Man, only in relation to what men are in their entirety can a social system be judged just or unjust. Otherwise, it can be merely assessed or relatively efficient or inefficient. From his essay, The Moment of Cubism, the Cubists were the first artists to attempt to paint totalities rather than agglomerations. From Revolutionary Undoing on the Marxist art historian Max Raphael, quoting Raphael, actual form is description, effective form is suggestive. I.e., through it, the artist trying to convey the contents of feelings to the viewer by fully describing them, provides him with as many clues as he needs to produce these contents and feelings within himself. To achieve this, the artist must act upon individual sense organs, not upon individual sense organs, but upon the whole man, i.e., he must make the viewer live in the work's own mode of reality. In 2017, it's so strange for me to re-encounter this respect for the total person. It almost makes me weep. Is there anything to which our political, media, and digital cultures are more savagely resistant? In his essay on Fernand Léger, Berger writes that Léger wanted to construct a world where the link between man's imagination and his ability to fashion and control with his hands was always emphasized. This, I'm certain, is the principal explanation of why he simplified and stylized objects and landscapes in the way he did. He wanted to make everything he included in his art tangible and unmysterious, not because he was a mechanical 19th century rationalist, but because he was so impressed by the greater mystery, the mystery of man's insatiable desire to hold and understand. Can we take on Berger's writing in terms of holding and understanding? And the final observation that I wanted to make, everyone who's read Berger knows that he thought deeply about how art and writing needed to live and why their existence mattered. In his essay on Walter Benjamin, who clearly marked him, he wrote, "Works of art await use, but their real usefulness lies in what they actually are, which may be quite distinct from what they once were, rather than in what it may be convenient to believe they are." He did not want to explain the appearance of the work. He wanted to discover the place that its existence needed to occupy in our knowledge. He wanted the art of the past to realize itself in the choices men make today in deciding their own historical role. In his essay on Raphael, who may have marked him even more, Berger wrote, "To return now to our original question, what is the revolutionary meaning of art? Raphael shows that the revolutionary meaning of a work of art has nothing to do with the subject matter in itself or with the functional use to which the work is put, but is a meaning continually awaiting discovery and release." Then he quotes Raphael, "To a certain extent, it's up to every individual by his participating in social and political life to decide whether art shall or shall not become obsolete. The understanding of art helps raise this decision to its highest level. As a vessel formed by the creative forces which it preserves, The work of art keeps alive and enhances every urge to come to terms with the world. We have said that art leads us from the work to the process of creation. This reversion, outside the theory of art, will eventually generate universal doubt about the world as given, the natural as well as the social. There's so much hope here, so many directions which those of us who love art and writing can turn.
This is kind of an answer to the question, what can we as artists and art writers do in the face of this rising chauvinism and racism and fascism in the US through our writing? And John Berger seems to have cracked that. He has the recipe for that. So I'm going to read one of his political texts. This is from A Moment in Ramallah. He was a great friend of the Palestinians, and his death was mourned heavily within ordinary Palestinians, not only the intellectuals. And this is from his essay collection, Hold Everything Dear, Dispatches on Survival and Resistance. Long ago, newly married couples planted roses in Ramallah gardens as an augury for their future life together. The alluvial soil suited the roses. Today, there is not a wall in the town center of Ramallah, now the capital of the Palestinian Authority, which is not covered with photographs of the dead, taken when alive and now reprinted as small posters. The dead are the martyrs of the Second Intifada, which began in September 2000. The martyrs include all of those killed by the Israeli army and settlers, and those who decided to sacrifice themselves in suicidal counterattacks. These faces transform the desultory street walls into something as intimate as a wallet of private papers and pictures. The wallet has a pocket for the magnetic ID card issued by the Israeli Security Service, and without which no Palestinian can travel even a few kilometers, and another pocket for eternity. Around the posters, the walls are scarred with bullet and sharpener marks. I'm going to skip forward. He narrates some of the stories of the people on those posters on the walls, and here's one. Abdelhamid Khatri, 30 years old, painter and writer. When young, he had trained as a medical nurse. He volunteered to join the medical emergency unit for rescuing and taking care of the wounded. His corpse was found near a checkpoint after a night where there had been no confrontations. His fingers had been cut off. A thumb was hanging loose. An arm, a hand, and his jaw were broken. There were 20 bullets in his body. I want to do a drawing for Khatri. Very early in the morning, we go to the village of Ain Kenya, and beyond it, there's a Bedouin encampment near a wadi. The sun is not hot yet. The goats and sheep are grazing more or less between the tents. I've chosen to draw the hills looking eastwards. I sit on a rock near a small blackish tent. I have only a notebook and this pen. There's a discarded plastic mug on the earth, and it gives me the idea of fetching some of the water from the trickle of the nearby spring to mix when necessary with my ink. After I've been drawing for a while, a young man, every invisible person in this camp has of course noticed me, approaches, undoes the entrance to the tent behind me, enters and comes out holding up a decrepit white plastic stool which he indicates might be more comfortable than the rock. I guess that before he found it, it must have been thrown into the street by some pastry shop or ice cream parlor. I thank him. And sitting on this customer's stool in the Bedouin camp, as the sun gets hotter and the frogs in the almost dry riverbed begin to croak, I go on drawing. On a hilltop, a few kilometers to the left, is an Israeli settlement. It looks military, as if it was part of a weapon designed for quick handling, yet it's small and far away. The near limestone hill facing me has the form of a gigantic sleeping animal's head, the rocks scattered on like bears in its matted hair. Suddenly frustrated by my lack of pigment, I pour water from the mug onto the dust at my feet, dip my finger into the mud, and smear color across the drawing of the animal's head. The sun is hot now. A mule brays. I turn the pages of the notebook to begin another and another. Nothing looks finished. When the young man eventually returns, he wants to see my drawings. I hold up the open notebook. He smiles. I turn a page. He points. Ours, he says. Our dust. He's pointing at my finger, not the drawing. And then we both sit and look at the hill for a while. Thank you.
Hello. So, before I read my selection, I've been asked by Jose Peña Loyola, who couldn't be here today, to read a short poem written by Berger, which he also used in his thesis as the epigraph. So I'm going to start with that. It's called History, and again, it's a short poem by Berger. The pulse of the dead, as interminably constant as the silence which pockets the thrush. The eyes of the dead, inscribed on our palms as we walk on this earth, which pockets the thrush. That's history. So, like most photography students, my introduction to Berger was through ways of seeing and to understanding a photograph. I'm not going to read from those. Instead, I'm going to read from And Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos, because it's something I came into contact with after I left my home state, and I felt like it defined it more than most other authors. So it's called Once in a Story. We are both storytellers. Lying on our backs, we look up at the night sky. This is where our stories began, under the aegis of the multitude of stars which at night filch certitudes and sometimes return to them as faith. Those who first invented and then named the constellations were storytellers. Tracing an imaginary line between a cluster of stars gave them an image and an identity. The stars threaded on that line were like events threaded on a narrative. Imagining the constellations did not, of course, change the stars, nor did it change the black emptiness that surrounds them. What it changed was the way people read the night sky. The problem of time is like the darkness of the sky. Every event is inscribed in its own time. Events may cluster and their times overlap, but the time in common between events does not extend as law beyond the clustering. A famine is a tragic cluster of events, to which the great plow is indifferent, existing as it does in another time. The lifespan of a hare on one hand and a tortoise on the other are prescribed in their cells. The likely duration of a life is a dimension of its organic structure. There is no way of comparing the time of the hare with that of the tortoise except by using an abstraction, which has nothing to do with either. Man introduced this abstraction and organized a race to discover which of the two would reach the finishing post first. Man is unique insofar as he constitutes two events, the event of his biological organism, and in this, he is like the tortoise and hare, and the event of his consciousness. Thus, in man, two times coexist, corresponding with these two events. The time during which he is conceived, grows, matures, ages, dies, and the time of his consciousness. The first time understands itself, which is why animals have no philosophical problems. The second time has been understood in different ways in different periods. It is indeed the first task of any culture to propose an understanding of the time of consciousness, of the relations of past to future, realized as such. The explanation offered by contemporary European culture, which, during the last 2 centuries, has increasingly marginalized other explanations, is that which constructs a uniform, abstract, unilinear law of time, applying to all events, and according to which all times can be compared and regulated. This law maintains that the great plow and the famine belong to the same calculus, a calculus which is indifferent to both. It also maintains that human consciousness is an event set in time, like any other. Thus, an explanation whose task is to explain the time of consciousness treats that consciousness as if it were a passive as geological stratum. If modern man has often become a victim of his own positivism, the process starts here with the denial or abolition of the time created by the event of consciousness. In reality, we are always between two times, that of the body and that of the consciousness. Hence the distinction made in all other cultures between body and soul. The soul is first, and above all, the locus of another time. What astounds cannot be the remnant of what has been. Tomorrow, still blind, advances slowly. Sight and light race towards each other, and form their embrace is born the day, eyes open, tall as a fall. Murmuring river clasps the mist for a moment more. The peaks are signing on the sky. Stop and hear the milking machines designed to suck like calves. In the first heat, the forested hills calculate their steepness. The lorry driver is taking the road to the pass, which leads surprisingly with its own familiarity to another homeland. Soon the grass will be warmer than the cow's horns. The astounding comes towards us, outsider of death and birth. Thank you.
My name's Will Fenstermaker. I wanted to read from the same book that Colin just read. A little later in the book, though. And Our Faces, My Heart as Brief as Photos was Berger's book on death, but it was also a book about home. Of all 19th century buildings, the mainline railway station was the one in which the ancient sense of destiny was most fully reinserted. Stock exchanges, banks, hotels, theaters, courts were built as pretenses, or to put it another way, they were already dreams. The railway station, whatever the extravagances of its decorative architecture, remained stark. And it remained so because it was a site of arrival and departure, where there was nothing to muffle the significance of those two events, coming and going, meeting and parting. Dreams welcomed the railway station so readily since it was already in other forms of familiar. The Greek word for porter is metaphor, and this is a reminder of how deeply the act of transporting, of dispatch and delivery is intrinsic to the imagination. In a railway station, the impersonal and the intimate coexist. On that late spring afternoon, few people had come. I was the only one to climb the railings, and there, clinging with one arm, to wait for the train to draw in. In the coaches which passed me, I saw people crowding round the doors, impatient to jump down. At that moment, I saw you at the end of the platform. You were wearing trousers. On the long platform beside the stranded train, in the vast white diffused late afternoon light of the Rift Valley, you looked very small. With your appearance, everything changed. Everything from the passage under the railway tracks to the sun setting, from the Arabic numerals on the board which announced the times of the trains, to the gulls perched on the roof, from the invisible stars to the taste of coffee on my palate. The world of circumstance and contingency into which, long before I had been born, became like a room, and I was home. You joined the queue of passengers who had to show their papers to the frontier police. The immigration officer looked you up and down, and studied the old photograph in your passport, searching for some trace of resemblance. Finally, he nodded, and you held out your arms to me. To the man selling newspapers by the bus stop, I was the same gray-haired foreigner who had bought a paper from him half an hour before. He could see no difference, except that then I had been alone, and now I was accompanied by a woman with a kerchief round her head, who also spoke with a foreign accent. During the 18th and 19th centuries, most direct protests against social injustice were in prose. They were reasoned arguments written in the belief that given time, people would come to see reason, and that finally history was on the side of reason. Today, this is by no means clear. The outcome is by no means guaranteed. The suffering of the present and the past is unlikely to be redeemed by a future era of universal happiness. And evil is a constant, ineradicable reality. All this means that the resolution, The coming to terms with the sense to be given to life cannot be deferred. The future cannot be trusted. The moment of truth is now. And more it will be poetry rather than prose that receives this truth. Prose is far more trusting than poetry. Poetry speaks to the immediate wound. The boon of language is not tenderness. All that it holds with exactitude and without pity, even a term of endearment. The word is impartial. Its usage is all. The boon of language is that potentially it is complete. It has the potentiality of holding with words the totality of human experience, everything that has occurred and everything that may occur. It even allows space for the unspeakable. In this sense, one can say of language that it is potentially the only human home, the only dwelling place that cannot be hostile to man. For prose, this home is a vast territory, a country which it crosses through a network of tracks, pathways, highways. For poetry, this home is concentrated on a single center, a single voice, and this voice is simultaneously that of an announcement and a response to it. One can say anything to language. This is why it is a listener, closer to us than any silence or any God. Yet its very openness can signify indifference. Poetry addresses language in such a way as to close this indifference and to incite a caring. Every authentic poem contributes to the labor of poetry, and the task of this unceasing labor is to bring together what life has separated or violence has torn apart. Physical pain can usually be lessened or stopped only by action. All other human pain, however, is caused by one form or another of separation. And here the act of assuagement is less direct. Poetry can repair no loss, but it defies the space which separates. And it does this by its continual labor of reassembling what has been scattered. Poetry makes language care because it renders everything intimate. This intimacy is the result of the poem's labor, the result of the bringing together into intimacy of every act and noun and event and perspective to which the poem refers. There is nothing more substantial to place against the cruelty and indifference of the world than this caring. In that town across the water where all has been seen and the bricks are cherished like sparrows. In that town like a letter from home read again and again in a port. In that town with its library of tiles and its addresses recalled by Johann Vermeer, who died in debt. In that town across the water where the dead take the census and there are no vacant rooms, for his gaze occupies them all, where the sky is waiting to have news of a birth. In that town which pours from the eyes of those who left it, there, between two chimes of the morning, when fish are sold in the square and maps on the walls show the depth of the sea, in that town I am preparing for your arrival. What reconciles me to my own death more than anything else is the image of a place where your bones and mine are buried, thrown uncovered together. They are strewn there pell-mell. One of your ribs leans against my skull. A metacarpal of my left hand lies inside your pelvis. Against my broken ribs, your breast like a flower. The 100 bones of our feet are scattered like gravel. It is strange that this image of our proximity, concerning as it does mere phosphate of calcium, should bestow a sense of place. Yet it does. With you, I can imagine a place where to be phosphate of calcium is enough.
Hello, everyone. Permanent Red is John Berger's first published book, collection of essays actually in 1960. As you may know, as some of you may know, his US publishers pointedly retitled the book Toward Reality, Essays in Seeing. One of the essays in this book I am about to read, titled Who is an Artist, imagines the thought processes of an artist lying under a beech tree and assessing shapes, light, space, and volume. The reason I chose this essay is because I believe it prefaces all the argumentative pieces about the role of art in society, and it briefly indicates why Berger was a successful and popular teacher as well as a highly perceptive art critic. Who is an artist? You're lying on the grass in the sun, Above you is a beech tree. A slight wind lifts the lighter branches and turns the leaves. From a distance, this constant movement of the leaves makes it look as if green snow is falling in front of the tree's green surface, just as once silvery snow seemed to fall in front of the gray cinema screens. Through half-closed eyes, you gaze up. They are half-closed because you're watching intently. One bough extends further than the others. It is impossible to count the number of leaves on it. The blue sky, which you see through and around these leaves, is like the whiteness of paper round letters of words. The distribution of the leaves against the sky seems far from arbitrary. You find yourself wondering whether it might not be possible to explain their sequence as one can explain the sequence of letters and words in a book. Then you discover an image which, like a good teacher, gives direction to your confused thinking. Everything you begin to say to yourself, in order to achieve existence at all, must pierce the very center of a target. Anything which misses that center simply does not exist. But a teacher's words after he has gone often prove a disappointment. So you're left puzzling how the bough above you can be said to represent the entire spring. Thinking like this, you may be a philosopher, but I don't think you're a painter. You're lying with your head on your carefully folded jacket. The tree you calculate must be a good 60 feet tall. Can you discover any buds? You screw up your eyes. There are none left. Things must be at least a fortnight further advanced than at home. It's lower, of course, and protected by the downs. Then you try to see if you can distinguish the inconspicuous flowers. The bough is too high and the light is too bright. You remember that during famines, men ate beech fruit. After all, the beech belongs to the same family as the sweet chestnut, and pigs are turned into beech woods in the autumn. But then pigs eat anything. Your eyes travel along the bough. Its shape is like the outline of a horse's hind legs seen from the side. You're becoming sleepy. But as you look up, you imagine throwing your rope over that bough. You're no longer thinking, you're drifting, and your eyes are almost shut. Yet the palms of your hands and the insides of your knees go tense at the memory of climbing along such twisting branches as a child. For you, the parts of the tree are there to master in one way or another, but not through painting. Idly and every so often you close your eyes. Then the image of the pattern of the leaves remains for a moment before it fades, imprinted on your retina, but now deep red, the color of the darkest rhododendron. When you reopen your eyes, the light is so brilliant that you have the sensation of it breaking against you in waves, reminding you of how small an island you are in the grass. You're aware of the children playing around you, and by some association too quick for you to notice, although you will remember it in retrospect, you marvel at how many birds a tree can hide. At dusk, when a man approaches, a flock of 40 or 50 starlings can scatter upwards from a single May tree to circle the sky once more, like painted birds on a fan suddenly opened and then slowly shut again. The tree is full of incidents, imagined and remembered. But for you, above all, this tree exists in time, and its size and its greenness and the reasoning of the man who originally planted it, no less than the reasoning of the man who may order it to be felled, all remind you of this fact. Suddenly you notice that the sky is not uniform blue. There, above the tree, is a vertical streak of paler blue, branching out at its top end in several directions. In fact, it's like a tree itself, you say. Then you watch it change into a lion's head. You're using your eyes, like a poet perhaps, but not like a painter. You lie there, you can smell the grass. You're more than usually conscious of the warmth of the sun. You have the sensation that you're stretched across the world and so can feel the curve of the earth. Nothing about the tree surprises you. You look at it as an actor may look at the auditorium. And your drama, your arm is round another waist, a hand strokes through your hair, you may be anybody, but at the moment you see the tree as only a lover sees it. The tree is an X marking a spot for you both. You do not look. What sense is there in lying down if you still have to use your eyes? You half listen to the wind. The leaves sound like sand being tipped. When you wake, you look up very warily. You see green, blue, green mixed with dirt, white. The green has taken every trace of yellow out of the blue. That fact is certain. everything else is confused. Without concentrating very hard and as if with your hands, you begin to sort out what you can see, imitating the skill of the flower sellers who know exactly which sprig to put with which. You learn to distinguish the swags of foliage, allotting each to its own branch and to its own proper position in space. You begin to test the angles of the branches like a fitter, not like a mathematician. You do your best to belittle that tree, to reduce it to a tangible size and simplicity. You close your eyes again, but now you're concentrating. You're thinking of your own painting. How can it adapt itself to admit such a tree? How can it keep such a tree at its proper place? Gradually, you're able to imagine it appearing in your painting. Yet at the moment, it's scarcely more than a sign made with your own fingers, like the church steeple and the parson. But you're no lumberjack. You can't transport trees and roll them, nor can you plant them in your soil from seeds. When you open your eyes to look at the actual tree, you try your hardest to see it as you have just imagined your painted tree, but you can't. It remains there. Again, close your eyes once more. Tap the tree that belongs to your painting. Open and check. It is closer, but the beach still towers and shimmers above you. Again and again, and so you may lie until it is dark and be a painter.
I'm going to read a shortened version of an essay called Field from 1971. Should I wait? Okay. And it's collected in a book of essays called About Looking. And this essay is an exercise in giving language to what John Berger calls pre-verbal experience. But I think it also speaks to me of a man carving out the parameters of his life in such a way that he might notice more and subtler things within it, and who was always ready for these things to surprise him. Yeah. Oh, this mic. Ah. Shelf of a field, green, within easy reach, the grass on it not yet high, papered with blue sky through which yellow has grown to make pure green, the surface color of what the basin of the world contains, a tendon field, shelf between sky and sea, fronted with a curtain of printed trees, friable at its edges, the corners of it rounded, answering the sun with heat, shelf on a wall through which from time to time a cuckoo is audible, shelf on which she keeps the invisible and intangible jars of her pleasure, field that I have always known. I am lying raised up on one elbow, wondering whether in any direction I can see beyond where you stop. The wire around you is the horizon. Remember what it was like to be sung to sleep. If you were fortunate, the memory will be more recent than childhood. The repeated lines of words and music are like pads. These pads are circular, and the rings they make are linked together like those of a chain. You walk along these paths and are led by them in circles which lead from one to the other further and further away. The field upon which you walk and upon which the chain is laid is the song. Into the silence, which was also at times a roar, of my thoughts and questions, forever returning to myself to search there for an explanation of my life and its purpose. Into this concentrated tiny hub of dense, silent noise came the cackle of a hen from a nearby back garden. And at that moment, that cackle, its distinct, sharp-edged existence beneath the blue sky with white clouds, induced in me an intense awareness of freedom. The noise of the hen, which I could not even see, was an event, like a dog running or an artichoke flowering, in a field which until then had been awaiting a first event in order to become itself realizable. I knew that in that field I could listen to all sounds, all music. From the city centre, there are two ways back to the satellite city in which I live. The main road, with a lot of traffic, and a side road which goes over a level crossing. The second is quicker unless you have to wait for a train at the crossing. During the spring and early summer, I invariably take the side road, and I find myself hoping that the level crossing will be shut. In the angle between the railway lines and the road, there is field, surrounded on its other two sides by trees. This field affords me considerable pleasure. Why then do I not sometimes walk there? It is quite near my flat, instead of relying on being stopped there by the closed level crossing. It is a question of contingencies overlapping. The events which take place in the field two birds chasing one another, a cloud crossing the sun and changing the color of green, acquire a special significance because they occur during the minute or two during which I am obliged to wait. It is as though these minutes fill a certain area of time which exactly fits the spatial area of the field. Time and space conjoin. The experience which I am attempting to describe by one tentative approach after another is very precise and is immediately recognizable. But it exists at a level of perception and feeling which is probably pre-verbal, hence very much the difficulty of writing about it. The experience in one form or another is, I believe, a common one. It is seldom referred to only because it is nameless. You are before the field, although it seldom happens that your attention is drawn to the field before you have noticed an event within it. Usually the event draws your attention to the field and, almost instantaneously, your own awareness of the field then gives a special significance to the event. The first event, since every event is part of a process, invariably leads to other, or more precisely, invariably leads you to observe others in the field. If you saw a tree being struck by lightning, the dramatic force of the event would inevitably lead you to interpret it in terms which, at that moment, would seem larger than the field before you. So, the first event should not be overdramatic, but otherwise it can be almost anything. Two horses grazing, a dog running in narrow circles, an old woman looking for mushrooms, a hawk hovering above, finches chasing each other from bush to bush, chickens pottering, two men talking, a flock of sheep moving exceedingly slowly from one corner to the center, a voice calling, a child walking. The first event leads you to notice further events which may be consequences of the first, or which may be entirely unconnected with it, except that they take place in the same field. Often the first event, which fixes your attention, is more obvious than the subsequent ones. Having noticed the dog, you notice a butterfly. Having noticed the horses, you hear a woodpecker and then see it fly across a corner of the field. You watch a child walking, and when he has left the field, deserted and eventless, you notice a cat jump down into it from the top of a wall. By this time you are within the experience, yet saying this implies narrative time, and the essence of the experience is that it takes place outside such time. The experience does not enter into the narrative of your life, that narrative which, at one level or another of your consciousness, you are continually retelling and developing to yourself. On the contrary, this narrative is interrupted. The visible extension of the field in space displaces awareness of your own lived time. By what precise mechanism does it do this? You relate the events which you have seen and are still seeing to the field. It is not only that the field frames them, it also contains them. The existence of the field is the precondition for their occurring in the way that they have done, and for the way in which others are still occurring. All events exist as definable events in virtue of their relation to other events. You may complain that I have now suddenly changed my use of the word event. At first I referred to a field as a space awaiting events. Now I refer to it as an event in itself. But this inconsistency parallels exactly the apparently illogical nature of the experience. Suddenly, an experience of disinterested observation opens in its center and gives birth to a happiness which is instantly recognizable as your own. The field that you are standing before appears to have the same proportions as your own life.
Hi, my name's Charlie Schultz. I am alumni, graduated 2012, and I have to say this is an amazing place to come back to. I'm very, very happy to be able to participate tonight. I chose Pig Earth because one of the things I really took away from Berger was, and from this program in general, was that power of observation and the power of insight and the ability to write good sentences can make for the most versatile writing. And I also thought the attention that he paid to peasants is apt at this moment in our political situation. A question of place. Over the cow's brow, the sun places a black leather mask and ties it to the horns. The leather has become black through usage. The cow can see nothing. For the first time, a sudden night has been fitted to her eyes. It will be removed in less than a minute when the cow is dead. During 1 year, the leather mask provides for the walk of 10 paces between fasting stable and slaughterhouse, 20 hours of night. The slaughterhouse is run by an old man. His wife, who is 15 years younger, and their son, who is 28. Seeing nothing, the cow is hesitant to move, but the son pulls the rope around her horns, and the mother follows. If I had kept her, the peasant says to himself, another 2 months until she calved, we could not have milked her any more, and after the birth she would have lost weight. Now is the best moment. At the door to the slaughterhouse, the cow hesitates again, then allows herself to be pulled in. Inside, high up near the roof, is a rail network. Wheels run on the rails, and from each wheel a bar hangs down with a hook on the end of it. Attached to this hook, a horse's carcass of 400 kilos can be pushed or pulled by a 14-year-old. The son places the springed bolt against the cow's head. A mask at an execution renders the victim more passive and protects the executioner from the last look of the victim's eyes. Here, the mask ensures that the cow does not turn her head away from the bolt, which stuns her. Her legs fold and her body collapses instantaneously. When a viaduct breaks, its masonry, seen from a distance, appears to fall slowly into the valley below. The same with the wall of a building following an explosion. But the cow came down fast as lightning, because it was not cement which held her together, but pure energy. Why didn't they slaughter her yesterday, says the peasant to himself. The son pushes the spring through the hole in the skull into the cow's brain. It goes in nearly 20 centimeters. He agitates it to be sure that the animal's muscles will relax, and he pulls it out. Life is liquid. The Chinese were wrong to believe that the essential was breath. Perhaps the soul is breath. The cow's pink nostrils are still quivering, her eyes staring, unseeing, her tongue falling out of the side of her mouth. In protest against the double abandonment by blood and brain, the cow's body twists violently and its hind legs lunge into the air. It is surprising that a large animal dies as quickly as a small one. The mother lets go of the foreleg, and it falls limply against the body. The son begins to cut away the hide around the horns. The son learnt his speed from his father, but now the old man's actions are slow. Ponderously at the back of the slaughterhouse, the father is splitting a horse in two. Between mother and son there is a complicity. They time their work together without a word. Occasionally they glance at each other, without smiling but with comprehension. She fetches a four-wheeled trolley like an elongated, very large open-work pram. He slits each hind leg with a single stroke of his tiny knife and inserts the hooks. She presses the button to start the electric hoist. The cow's carcass is lifted above them and then lowered on its back into the pram. Together, they push the pram forward. They work like tailors. Beneath the hide, the skin is white. They open the hide from neck to tail so that it becomes an unbuttoned coat. The peasant to whom the cow belongs comes over to the pram to point out why she had to be slaughtered. 2 of her teats were decomposing, and she was almost impossible to milk. He picks up a teat in his hand. It is as warm as in the stable when he milked her 2 hours earlier. The mother and son listen to him, nod, but do not reply and do not stop working. The son severs and twists off the 4 hooves and throws them into a wheelbarrow. The mother removes the udder. Then, through the cut hide, the son axes the breastbone. This is similar to the last axing of a tree before it falls, for from that moment onwards, the cow, no longer an animal, is transformed into meat, just as the tree is transformed into timber. The father leaves his horse and shuffles across the abattoir to go outside and pee. This he does 3 or 4 times each morning. When he walks for some other purpose, he walks more briskly. Yet it is hard to say whether he shuffles now because of the presence on his bladder or to remind his much younger wife that, whilst his old age may be pathetic, his authority is without remorse. Expressionless, his wife watches him until he reaches the door. Then she turns solemnly back to the meat and starts to wash it down and then to dab it dry with a cloth. The carcass surrounds her, but almost all tension has gone. She might be arranging a larder, except that the fibers of meat are still quivering from the shock of the slaughter, exactly as the skin of a cow's neck does in summer to dislodge the flies. The sun splits the two sides of beef with perfect symmetry. They are now sides of meat, such as the hungry have dreamt of for hundreds of thousands of years. The mother pushes them along the rail system to the scales. They weigh together 257 kilograms. The peasant checks the reading on the meter. He has agreed to 9 francs a kilo. He gets nothing for the tongue, the liver, the hooves, the head, the offal. The parts which are sold to the urban poor, the rural poor receive no payment for. Nor does he get paid for the hide. At home, in the stable, the place which the slaughtered cow occupied is empty. He puts one of the young heifers there. By next summer, she will have come to remember it, so that each evening and morning, when she is fetched in from the fields for milking, she will know which place in the stable is hers.
Animals first entered the imagination as messengers and promisers. For example, the domestication of cattle did not begin as a simple prospect of milk and meat. Cattle had magical functions, sometimes oracular, sometimes sacrificial, and the choice of a given species as magical, tameable, and alimentary was originally determined by the habits, proximity, and invitation of the animal in question. White ox, good is my mother, and we the people of my sister, the people of Nyariao Bull, friend, great ox of the spreading horns, whichever bellows amid the herd, ox of the son of Bull, Maloa. Animals are born, are sentient, and are mortal. In these things they resemble man. In their superficial anatomy, less in their deep anatomy. In their habits, in their time, in their physical capacities, they differ from man. They are both like and unlike. We know what animals do and what beaver and bears and salmon and other creatures need, because once our men were married to them and they acquired this knowledge from their animal wives. They are greedy as Ishe Katavazi. I want them to graze in the newly burnt grass of Rwanda. When they stampede, they are loud as the morning rain. They're searching for the progeny of the spotted bull. They stand still, graceful, with their encircling horns, like queens preparing their curls. They are dressed in sported cloth. They are well behaved as they play in the rain. The light rain has given them shade. They have kept their secret, the new grass in the valleys. They have spent the day at the muzizi trees of Katoma. When they come home, loneliness vanishes. She who wears the bell and she whose horns encircle like handcuffs thanked him for bringing them from an evil country. How straight are the horns of the daughter of the one who excels all others. The horns of the one who gambles are spotless. The reed-like horns of the daughter of the spotted one stand erect. There is no dust on the horns of the one who is made forgetful by dancing. She stretches out her horns till they reach to the Pleiades. When she stretches them back, we can see Rumuranka. She whose horns reach to the stars is graceful in her circlet. She whose horns are too wide for the trough has departed, too long for a thing, and to see it. It is as though you had seen Kihondwa and Rukari. I used to long for an active cow, now I am blessed by the daughter of Karanga's beast. At Bijinja, which faces Mukande, she who drives all cattle before her walks in Chiganda style. She who goes at speed to her shade, the brown cow, the daughter of the spotted one, is like a new back cloth, soft as though smoked. Do not cut the tips of her horns and thus spoil them. The fighter tyrannizes over her neighbors. When they were gambolizing in the hills, those who were called whistles, at little Nshwere, which faces Mpabura, they took themselves to the troughs of others when their water was gone. Here you are, you troublemakers, the insignificant ones. You have begun again upsetting your neighbors. You should give them a second bell. Those with few cattle should separate. She who seeks no quarrel lolls like the palace harp as she stays in the sheds. Thank you.
Hi guys, I'm Aimee Walleston, and I'm reading from the masterpiece. I'm the only person, but I am reading that from that because I think when I first read this book, I was thinking a lot about the ways in which we perform our identity, and I kind of felt like I was a little bit crazy for how I thought about that. And then when I read this book, particularly chapter 3, I felt a deep sense of solace. I'm going to speak as my identity as a woman. Our consciousness provides a home for 2 identities. And each of these identities has kind of a part in designing our identity. There's the artist, who's always sculpting herself to perform for the world. And then there's a critic, who's always analyzing and critiquing her own sculpture. And it's only by developing a third identity, or a third entity, that of the true observer, that we can recognize both the artist and her critic, and we can invite them to consider what we have to gain through this endless busy work. And we can become truly free from the prisons of our own personalities. So in this chapter, John Berger introduces us to this third entity and gives us a few of the tools that we need to set ourselves free. According to usage and conventions, which are at last being questioned, but have by no means been overcome, the social presence of a woman is different in kind from that of a man. A man's presence is dependent upon the promise of power which he embodies. If the promise is large and credible, his presence is striking. If it is small or incredible, he is found to have little presence. The promised power may be moral, physical, temperamental, economic, social, sexual, but its object is always exterior to the man. A man's presence suggests that what he is capable of doing to you or for you. His presence may be fabricated in the sense that he pretends to be capable of what he is not. But the pretense is always towards a power, which he exercises on others. By contrast, a woman's presence expresses her own attitude to herself. It defines what can and cannot be done to her. Her presence is manifest in her gestures, voice, opinions, expressions, clothes, chosen surroundings, taste. Indeed, there is nothing she can do which does not contribute to her presence. Presence for a woman is so intrinsic to her person that men tend to think of it as almost physical emanation, a kind of heat or smell or aura. To be born a woman has been to be born within an allotted and confined space into the keeping of men. The social presence of women has developed as a result of their ingenuity in living under such tutelage within such a limited space. But this has been at the cost of women's self being split in two. A woman must continually watch herself. She is almost continually accompanied by her own image of herself. While she is walking across a room or whilst she is weeping at the death of her father, she can scarcely avoid envisaging herself walking or weeping. From earliest childhood, she's been taught and persuaded to survey herself continually. And so she comes to consider the surveyor and the surveyed within her as the two constituent, yet always distinct elements of her identity as a woman. She has to survey everything she is and everything she does because how she appears to others and ultimately how she appears to men is of crucial importance for what is normally thought of as the success of her life. Her own sense of being in herself is supplanted by a sense of being appreciated as herself by another. Men survey women before treating them. Consequently, how a woman appears to a man can determine how she will be treated. To acquire some control over this process, women must contain it and interiorize it. The part of a woman's self which is surveyor treats the part of the surveyed so as to demonstrate to others how her whole self would like to be treated, as this exemplary treatment of herself by herself constitutes her presence. Every woman's presence regulates what is and is not permissible within her presence. Every one of her actions, whether it's direct purpose or motivation, is also read as an indication of how she would like to be treated. If a woman throws a glass on the floor, this is an example of how she treats her own emotion of anger, and so of how she would wish it to be treated by others. If a man does the same, his action is read only as an expression of anger. If a woman makes a good joke, this is an example of how she treats the joker in herself, and accordingly how she, as a joker woman, would like to be treated by others. Only a man can make a good joke for its own sake. One might simplify this by saying men act and women appear. Men look at women, women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus she turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight. And then he goes on, and it's amazing, and I really suggest reading the rest of it. And now we have David Levi Strauss.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased with what's happened tonight, and I think John liked it too. Hearing his words through so many different voices, it's one of the ways that we talk to the dead. I'm also pleased because it hasn't been a mourning for John. It's a celebration of his work by readers and writers. There's really nothing to mourn. He lived an exceptionally long and productive and loving life. And then he died at age 90, soon after his partner of 40 years died. I've been asked to write a remembrance of John for publication, and I'm in the middle of doing that now. It's past due. The deadline is, so I have a gun at my head. It's not finished, so I'm going to just give you some memories tonight. I also wanted to say that I'm very pleased to have this done here, since the program in art writing is really built to foster the kind of writing that John did. I don't remember when I first read John Berger's writing, but as soon as I did, it opened everything up for me. I could see a way forward. For me at that time, it was a way to write about photography. This is in the 70s and 80s, but it became more than that. A long time later, in 1997, I published a piece in The Nation about John and said this: where would any of us be without the example of John Berger? I mean any of us who care about the conflicted relation between art and politics, and who crave a radical criticism that is both accessible and deep, embodied and informed. Berger has survived and flourished for over 50 years as a radical writer outside of the academy, reaching a wide audience with his lucid prose. The key to his success has been his continued willingness and ability to approach works of art with a clear and questioning eye, sweeping aside a priori assessments to deal with what is actually before him. In a 1970 essay on one of his most influential forebears, Walter Benjamin Berger wrote, and you've heard this before at the beginning, works of art await use, but their real usefulness lies in what they actually are, which may be quite distinct from what they once were, rather than in what it may be convenient to believe they are. In Berger's writing, as in Benjamin's, this radical realism has a political base. This is one of the most important things about Berger's achievement to me, is this implicit, or I would say implicate, relation between aesthetics and politics. Benjamin said it can't be good criticism if it's not good writing. It can't be true politically if it's not true aesthetically. That changes things. The reason that Berger gathered such a large audience for his work is that this implicate politics of writing necessarily includes the reader in the process. Everyone feels like he is speaking directly to them, with them. It's not about some expert delivering the goods to the lesser people. It's a conspiracy of engagement. So let's jump ahead a little. When I was studying in the poetics program in San Francisco with all the poets, I worked with Michael Palmer. And Michael had translated John and Alan Tanner's screenplay for Jonah Who Will Be 25 in the year 2000. The film was made in 1976, but the translation wasn't done until 1983 when I was working with Michael. So at some point, Michael suggested that I write to my literary lodestar, John Berger, and I did. This would have been 1998. I sent John the manuscript for my first book of essays, Between Dog and Wolf, and a few days later, after he'd gotten it, he called me from Paris, I think, and we talked for at least 2 hours. It might have been 3. It was as if we'd known each other for years. There was no interference, no breaks on it. He loved the book and wrote a blurb for it. And 4 years later, when Aperture published my second book of essays, Between the Eyes, John wrote an introduction to the book. He got exactly what I was trying to do in the writing, and that changed everything for me. We continued to correspond, but we didn't meet in person until June of 2009, when I visited him in Cancy in the French Alps. He opened his house to me completely, and we had a wonderful time. And late into the night, deep into the eau de vie, we exchanged secrets. And he charged me to do certain things in my writing that I only pray I have enough time and courage to do. I want to admit something here. When he called me out of the blue in 1998 and we talked as friends, I thought this was a unique event, unique to me. I thought we had a bond between writers like no other. It was only some time later that I discovered that there was a whole community of people who had this unique experience with John. All felt singular. That was a big part of his gift as a writer and as a person, to make every reader and everyone he opened up to personally feel this singularity. After his death, I've collected and read most of the obituaries that have appeared in English since John died on January 2nd. This is one of the things, for the last 20 years, everything that he wrote was sent out by Beverly and translated into 30 languages. So it really was a global writing at that point. So one of the things in reading all these obituaries that's irritated me a little about, especially the tributes coming from the art world especially, is that they have tended to occlude the fact that John was a lifelong committed socialist and a fierce troublemaker. His first collection of art criticism was titled Permanent Red for a reason. He paid for his radical politics early on and became more radical, not less, as he aged. At one point he said, "I now believe there is an absolute incompatibility between art and private property, or between art and state property, unless the state is a plebeian democracy. Property must be destroyed before imagination can develop further." Looking back to the introduction he wrote for Between the Eyes, I'm surprised to find his repeated references to the Kurds, which I'd forgotten when Mick Taussig, Peter Lamborn Wilson, Dilar Dirac, and I put together the book on the Rojava Revolution in northern Syria last year. He was always ahead of us in his analysis. When asked what he thought his most important book was, he usually answered A Seventh Man from 1975. Its subject, migrant workers in Europe, and, quote, "the basic bourgeois claim that social inequality is finally an expression of natural inequality," is even more relevant now than it was 40 years ago. I'd like to just leave you with a couple of paragraphs from his introduction. The new tyranny, like other recent ones, depends to a large degree on a systematic abuse of language. Together we have to reclaim our hijacked words and reject the tyranny's nefarious euphemisms. If we do not, we will be left with only the word shame. Not a simple task, for most of its official discourse is pictorial, associative, evasive, full of innuendos. Few things are said in black and white. Both military and economic strategists now realize that the media plays a crucial role, not so much in defeating the current enemy as in foreclosing and preventing mutiny, protests, or desertion. Any tyranny's manipulation of the media is an index of its fears. The present one lives in the fear of the world's desperation. A fear so deep that the adjective desperate, except when it means dangerous and refers to someone else, is never used. Without money, each daily human need becomes a pain. Those who have filched power, and they are not all in office, so they reckon on a continuity of that power beyond presidential elections. Pretend to be saving the world and offering its population the chance to become their clients. The world consumer is sacred. What they don't add is that consumers matter only because they generate profit, which is the only way that it is really sacred. This sleight of hand leads us to the crux. Every form of contestation against this tyranny is comprehensible. Dialogue with it is impossible. For us to live and die properly, things have to be named properly. Let us reclaim our words. Well, there's much, much more to say, but we have time to do that. John had just enough time to live and love and write. I know that he was not afraid of death. And I suspect that this might have been why death was not in a hurry to take him. Thank you all for doing this, and please stay and talk. We have pizza and wine. Thanks.